I'm determined to be very strong to fight against terrorism, to use all the tools we have, to invest for the monitoring, the inspectors, the professionalism, the best experts we may have to fight terrorism, and to do it in strong relationship with our allies around the world. But these two provisions especially have done nothing to fight against terrorism, have not been helpful, and continue to create some risk for civil liberties. And it's why we are proposing to sunset them tonight. It's completely unfair, it's completely untrue, and it's outrageous. We may have disagreements about these two clauses, but we know that nobody wants to be soft on terrorism. It's very outrageous from the Prime Minister to say so.
Pursuant to order made on Thursday, February 22nd, 2007, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorder division on the motion in relation to the statutory order. The question is as follows. Mr. Nicholson, seconded by Mr. Hill. Moved that pursuant to subsection 83.321 of the Criminal Code, the application of sections 83.28, 83.29, and 83.3 of that Act be extended for a period of 3 years from the first day on which this resolution is passed by both Houses of Parliament, and 2, that this resolution come into force on the day on which it has been passed by both Houses of Parliament.
Motion will please rise.
Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper. Port Moody, Westwood, Port Coquitlam.
Mr. Moore, Port Moody, Westwood, Port Coquitlam.
Ms. Oda.
Ms. Oda.
Mr. Thompson, New Brunswick Southwest.
Mr. Thompson, New Brunswick Southwest.
Mr. O'Connor.
Mr. O'Connor.
Mr. Taves.
Mr. Taves.
Mr. Day.
Mr. Day.
Mr. Nicholson.
Mr. Nicholson.
Mr. McKay, Central Nova.
Mr. McKay, Central Nova.
Mr. Prentice.
Mr. Prentice.
Mr. Cannon, Pontiac.
Mr. Cannon, Pontiac.
Mr. Flaherty.
Mr. Flaherty.
Mr. Clement.
Mr. Clement.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Solberg.
Mr. Solberg.
Mr. Emerson.
Mr. Emerson.
Mr. Hearn.
Mr. Hearn.
Mr. Lunn.
Mr. Lunn.
Mrs. Ablonsey.
Mrs. Ablonsey.
Mr. Fletcher.
Mr. Fletcher.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Richardson.
Mr. Richardson.
Mr. Cummins.
Mr. Cummins.
Mr. Moore, Fundy Royal.
Mr. Moore, Fundy Royal.
Mrs. Hinton.
Mrs. Hinton.
Mr. Kenny, Calgary Southeast.
Mr. Kenny, Calgary Southeast.
Mr. Ritz.
Mr. Ritz.
Mr. Baird.
Mr. Baird.
Mr. Bernier.
Mr. Bernier.
Mr. Blackburn.
Mr. Blackburn.
Madame Verner.
Madame Verner.
Mr. Van Loan.
Mr. Van Loan.
Mr. Hill.
Mr. Hill.
Ms. Ambrose.
Ms. Ambrose.
Ms. Finley.
Ms. Finley.
Mrs. Skelton.
Mrs. Skelton.
Monsieur Paradis.
Mr. Paradis.
Ms. Georges.
Ms. Georges.
Mr. Menzies.
Mr. Menzies.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Camp, Pitt Meadows Maple Ridge Mission.
Mr. Camp, Pitt Meadows Maple Ridge Mission.
Mr. Benoit.
Mr. Benoit.
Mr. Breitkreutz.
Mr. Breitkreutz.
Mr. Hanger.
Mr. Hanger.
Mr. Harris.
Mr. Harris.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Anders.
Mr. Anders.
Mr. Hebert.
Mr. Hebert.
Mr. Poilievre.
Mr. Poilievre.
Mr. Mackenzie.
Mackenzie.
Mr. Warawa.
Mr. Warawa.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Jean.
Mr. Jean.
Madame Boucher.
Madame Boucher.
Mr. Bernouge.
Mr. Bernouge.
Mr. Lukiski.
Mr. Lukiski.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Lozon.
Mr. Lozon.
Mr. Kamarnicki.
Mr. Kamarnicki.
Mrs. Yelich.
Mrs. Yelich.
Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Casson.
Mr. Casson.
Mr. Doyle.
Mr. Doyle.
Mr. Keddy, South Shore St. Margaret.
Mr. Keddy, South Shore St. Margaret.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Mr. Goldring.
Mr. Goldring.
Mr. Albrecht.
Mr. Albrecht.
Mr. Allen.
Mr. Allen.
Mr. Lunny.
Mr. Lunny.
Mr. Mark.
Mr. Mark.
Mr. Merrifield.
Mr. Merrifield.
Mr. Rajat.
Mr. Rajat.
Mr. Sorensen.
Mr. Sorensen.
Mr. Velikot.
Mr. Velikot.
Mr. Schellenberger.
Mr. Schellenberger.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Batters.
Mr. Batters.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Jaffer.
Mr. Jaffer.
Mr. Brown, Leeds Grenville.
Mr. Brown, Leeds Grenville.
Mr. DeVolan.
Mr. DeVolan.
Mr. Goodyear.
Mr. Goodyear.
Mrs. Greywall.
Mrs. Greywall.
Mr. Kahn.
Mr. Kahn.
Mr. Cramp, Prince Edward Hastings.
Mr. Cramp, Prince Edward Hastings.
Mr. Miller.
Mr. Miller.
Mr. Preston.
Mr. Preston.
Mrs. Smith.
Mrs. Smith.
Mr. Tilson.
Mr. Tilson.
Mr. Trost.
Mr. Trost.
Mr. Tweed.
Mr. Tweed.
Mr. Brown Barry.
Mr. Brown Barry.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Cannon, Kelowna Lake Country.
Mr. Cannon, Kelowna Lake Country.
Mrs. Davidson.
Mrs. Davidson.
Mr. Del Mastro.
Mr. Del Mastro.
Mr. Dykstra.
Mr. Dykstra.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Monsieur Harvey,
Monsieur Harvey,
Mr. Hon,
Mr. Hon,
Mr. Lake,
Mr. Lake,
Monsieur Lemieux,
Monsieur Lemieux,
Mr. Manning,
Mr. Manning,
Mr. Pallister,
Pallister,
Mr. Epp,
Mr. Epp,
Mr. Mays,
Mr. Mays,
Mr. Norlock,
Mr. Norlock,
Monsieur Petit,
Monsieur Pitsy,
Mr. Shipley,
Mr. Shipley,
Mr. Stanton,
Mr. Stanton,
Mr. Storseth,
Mr. Storseth,
Mr. Sweet,
Mr. Sweet,
Mr. Van Kesteren,
Mr. Van Kesteren,
Mr. Wallace,
Mr. Wallace,
Mr. Workington,
Mr. Workington,
Mr. Watson,
Mr. Watson,
Monsieur Blany,
Monsieur Blany,
Monsieur Galipeau,
Mr. Galipeau,
Mr. Cheer,
Mr. Shear,
Wappel, Monsieur Arthur,
Monsieur Arthur,
This one guy's got so bad, certainly their leader doesn't.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Volpe,
Mr. Volpe,
Mr. Bevilacqua,
Mr. Bevilacqua,
Ms. Fry,
Ms. Fry,
Ms. Bennett, Mr. Bryson,
Mr. Bryson,
Madame Robillard,
Madame Robillard,
Mr. Goodale,
Mr. Goodale,
Mr. Ignatieff, Dryden,
Mr. Dryden,
Mr. Camusi,
Mr. Camusi,
Ms. Guarnieri,
Ms. Guarnieri,
Mr. McCauley,
Mr. McCauley,
Madame Marlowe,
Madame Marlowe,
Mr. Maguire,
Mr. Maguire,
Mr. Easter,
Mr. Easter,
Delegates, Stefan. How many
Mr.
delegates?
Karajanis,
Mr. Karagianis,
Mr. Godfrey,
Mr. Godfrey,
Ms. Mina,
Ms. Mina,
Mr. Regan,
Mr. Regan,
Mr. Scott,
Mr. Scott,
Mr. Bélanger,
Mr. Bélanger,
Mr. Byrne,
Mr. Burns,
Mr. Chan,
Mr. Chan,
Mr. Cadet,
Mr. Quadet,
Ms. Rowe, Mr. Callum, Mrs. Redmond,
Mrs. Redmond,
Mr. Poon,
Mr. Poole,
Mr. Owen,
Mr. Owen,
Mr. Thibault, Westnova,
Mr. Thibault Westnova,
Turner,
Mr. Turner,
Ms. Stronach,
Ms. Strong,
Mr. Canis,
Mr. Canis,
You're a real liberal now,
Mr.
Garth.
Molly,
Mr. Molly,
Monsieur Bonin,
Mr. Bonnet,
Mr. Maloney,
Mr. Maloney,
Mr. McKay, Scarborough Guildwood,
Mr. McKay Scarborough Guildwood,
Mrs. Barnes,
Mrs. Barnes,
Ms. Brown Oakville,
Ms. Brown Oakville,
Mr. Hubbard,
Mr. Hubbard,
Mr. Tig,
McKay,
Mr. Patry,
Mr. Patry,
Madame Folco,
Madame Folco,
Madame Jennings,
Madame Jennings,
Leblanc,
Monsieur Leblanc,
Mr. St. Dennis,
Mr. St. Dennis,
Mr. Steckley,
Mr. Steckley,
Mr. Zabo,
Mr. Zabo,
Mr. Telegdi,
Mr. Telegdi,
Ms. Paratek Lindell,
Caratak Lindell,
Mr. Matthews,
Mr. Matthews,
Mr. Cusner,
Mr. Cusner,
Mr. Murphy
Mr.
Charlottetown,
Murphy Charlottetown,
Mr. Zed,
Mr. Zed,
Mr. Iking,
Mr. Iking,
Ms. Neville,
Ms. Neville,
Mr. Simard,
Mr. Simard,
Mr. Baines,
Mr. Baines,
Mr. Boschkoff,
Mr. Boschkoff,
Mr. Damour,
Mr. Damour,
Ms. Gala,
Ms. Dalla,
Mr. Holland,
Mr. Holland,
Mr. McGinty,
Mr. McGinty,
Mr. Rodriguez,
Mr. Rodriguez,
Mr. Savage,
Mr. Savage,
Mr. Tonks,
Mr. Tonks,
Mr. Pachetti,
Mr. Pachetti,
Ms. Ratensi,
Ms. Ratansi,
Mrs. Cadis,
Mrs. Cadis,
Mr. Rota,
Mr. Rota,
Mr. Scarpelegia,
Mr. Scarpelegia,
Mr. Santamon,
Mr. Santamon,
Mr. Temokovsky,
Mr. Temokovsky,
Mr. Valley,
Mr. Valley,
Mr. Silva,
Mr. Silva,
Mr. Sims,
Mr. Sims,
Mr. Rizhnevsky,
Mr. Wisniewski,
Mr. Algabra,
Mr. Algapra,
Mr. Dollywall,
Dallywall,
Ms. Keeper,
Ms. Peeper,
Mr. Russell,
Mr. Russell,
Mr. Murphy, Moncton Riverview Dieppe,
Mr. Murphy, Moncton Riverview, Dieppe,
Mr. Wilson,
Mr. Wilson,
Mr. Pearson,
Mr. Pearson,
Monsieur Duceppe,
Monsieur Giuseppe,
Monsieur Paquette,
Monsieur Paquette,
Monsieur Gauthier,
Monsieur Gauthier,
Madame Lalonde,
Madame Lalonde,
Madame Gagnon,
Madame Gagnon,
Monsieur Ménard, Hochelaga,
Monsieur Ménard, Hochelaga,
Monsieur Crête,
Monsieur Crête,
Monsieur Bachon,
Monsieur Bachand,
Monsieur Laframboise,
Monsieur Laframboise,
Monsieur Asselin,
Monsieur Asselin,
Madame Picard,
Madame Picard,
Monsieur Guimont,
Monsieur Guimont,
Madame Gay,
Madame Gay,
Monsieur Plamondon,
Monsieur Plamondon,
Madame Brunel,
Madame Brunel,
Madame Saint-Hilaire,
Madame Saint-Hilaire,
Monsieur Roy,
Monsieur Roy,
Monsieur Bigra,
Monsieur Bigra,
Madame Demers,
Madame Demers,
Monsieur Lessard,
Monsieur Lessard,
Monsieur Cardin,
Monsieur Cardin,
Monsieur Ménard, Marcorel Fortin,
Monsieur Ménard, Marcorel Fortin,
Madame Fay,
Madame Fay,
Madame Thibault, Rimouski-Neget, Témiscouata-les-Basses,
Madame Thibault, Mousquinéget et Misquotin-les-Basses,
Monsieur Coteau,
Monsieur Coteau,
Madame Bourgeois,
Madame Bourgeois,
Monsieur Bellavance,
Monsieur Bellavance,
Madame Lavallée,
Madame Lavallée,
Monsieur Lemay,
Monsieur Lemay,
Monsieur Godet.
Monsieur Godet.
Madame Deschamps.
Madame Deschamps.
Monsieur Bouchard.
Monsieur Bouchard.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Monsieur Blais.
Monsieur Blais.
Madame Freeman.
Madame Freeman.
Monsieur Perron.
Monsieur Perron.
Monsieur Laforêt.
Monsieur Laforêt.
Madame Mourani.
Madame Mourani.
Monsieur Gravel.
Monsieur Gravel.
Monsieur Malo.
Monsieur Malo.
Monsieur Carrier.
Monsieur Carrier.
Monsieur Lévesque.
Monsieur Lévesque.
Monsieur Saint-Cyr.
Monsieur Saint-Cyr.
Monsieur Ouellette.
Monsieur Ouellette.
Monsieur André.
Monsieur André.
Monsieur Vincent.
Monsieur Vincent.
Monsieur Nadeau.
Monsieur Nadeau.
Mr. Layton.
Mr. Layton.
Ms. McDonough.
Ms. McDonough.
Ms. Washerly-Schlise.
Rosalie Chalice.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Martin. Sault Ste. Marie.
Mr. Martin Sault Ste. Marie.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Mr. Comartin.
Mr. Comartin.
Ms. Black.
Ms. Black.
Mr. Christopherson.
Mr. Christopherson.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Ms. Crowder.
Ms. Crowder.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Sixay.
Mr. Sixay.
Ms. Pretty.
Ms. Pretty.
Mrs. Matheson.
Mrs. Matheson.
Mr. Adamanenko.
Mr. Adamanenko.
Ms. Bell, Vancouver Island
Ms.
North.
Bell, Vancouver Island North.
Mr. Bevington.
Mr. Bevington.
Ms. Charlton.
Ms. Charlton.
Ms. Chow.
Ms. Chow.
Mr. Dewar.
Mr. Dewar.
Mr. Marston.
Mr. Marston.
Ms. Nash.
Ms. Nash.
Mr. Stoffer.
Mr. Stoffer.
Madame Savoie.
Madame Savoie.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Yeas pour 124, 124. Nays contre 159, 159.
Je déclare la motion rejetée.
I declare the motion defeated.